So Claudia, thank you so much for spending time with us. As I said, I was just so moved and by your story of as a teenager making the decision, the very bold and brave decision to go all the way across the country from Los Angeles, which is quite urban, from what I understand from what you said, to pretty rural part of Maine.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think you said bold and brave as descriptors. When I think about the decision that I made, it was, I think, more seeking adventure than rather being brave. And I think one of those things is I do look back on my trajectory throughout high school and, the point with which I had to make a decision. And I'm quite honest in the fact that I think I had great counseling, got amazing schools on my list. And then there was still this point of being somewhat naive, maybe, and not quite knowing what the full experience was going to be, but really being excited by newness and prospect of something that was different. And I know that I owe a lot of that bravery or just that adventuresome spirit to the fact that I had some opportunity when I was in middle school to travel with a teacher outside of California and really outside of Los Angeles. So I recognized that I had an opportunity to see a different neighborhood by all means, and realized that there was more to what was out there than how I had grown up, and really being excited by kind of the aspiration and the dream of like, maybe I could go somewhere different. And I think the other big piece that I credit with my decision was the fact that my mom was really supportive. She was terrified of letting me really think about going out of state, but she had seen the hard work I had done throughout high school and how excited I was about this idea of going to college and going to a place that was different than I had grown up. So I think those two things together allowed me to, as you said, be bold and make this decision. I think the other thing that I always think back to when I actually ended up leaving home and being in college was the fact that I really believed that I wasn't leaving my family. It was a momentary shift. And that, yes, even if I had gone to school in California, I grew up again in Koreatown, Los Angeles. And of the schools in California, the one that I was really most excited by, if I had to stay in California, was Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And part of that was because it was still going to be a move. And I think I really saw myself as being very close to my sisters. My grandmother lived with us and my mom. But I also knew that home was always going to be home. I would always be welcomed back to my family. And I wasn't leaving them. I was heading off to college to have an opportunity to hopefully make them proud and also have this opportunity to bring back something into my own home. So I think that was really important in my experience. And also, even as I experienced college, students are always surprised when I tell them I did not have a cell phone when I first started college, which again, I think many students now, even if it isn't an iPhone, they have some form of technology on them. And when I went off to college, it was actually before Facebook was even a thing. We didn't have FaceTime. All of the social media networks, WhatsApp that people are connected to just did not exist. And I think the plan that I had with my mom of weekly phone calls on a landline, I knew that I had something to look forward to that would connect me back at home. So I think those things helped. There are, by all means, the moments that were really hard. And I recognized that I did miss out on birthdays when I wasn't around. There's the reality that, yes, I wasn't with my family 24/7. But even if a student stays closer to home, and my friends from high school who did stay close, they made different choices. And again, weren't always around their families. So I think there's that processing and reality that students have to embrace, that you're not leaving family. You're going to come back. I've clearly made the choice to continue living on the East Coast, and that is very much a personal one, which I can get into a bit more. but I'm in constant connection with family. And I think that helped my mom and my grandmother also realize that it wasn't anything they had done, and that I would still be their daughter and granddaughter, and I would still be connected to the values and the beliefs that had been instilled in me as a teenager growing up.
Nice. And you had also mentioned that you were involved with the CBO.
Yep.
And what?
Yeah, there was a community-based organization that I worked with. I think it was maybe their second or third cohort of students, called One Voice in Los Angeles. And they are still fairly small. I think at maximum they work with about 25 students. So I had not only my counselor from the community-based organization, but also my high school counselor, who listened, and I think also were really excited when I said, I'm not necessarily crossing off schools outside of California. I think I'm actually most interested in them. And that's where they, I think, both became really excited, because they could actually put small liberal arts colleges on my list. I will admit I did not quite know what they were, what a liberal arts college was. But as I learned more and more about the small size, the attention to the individual, I think that's where I started to realize that even though I had gone to a somewhat small high school, I had about 150 graduating students in my class. And we were a school that went from 6th grade through 12. So the population of students was actually large, but my individual graduating class was smaller. That I started to recognize, going to a place like UCLA or Berkeley or even USC, as amazing as those institutions are, I was going to get lost in a crowd. And that's where I had to do some soul searching. And I realized I would have moments of anxiety. I now can name that it was anxiety whenever I had to speak up in a class. I knew I had to, and it was part of not only my grade, but I wanted to be an eager learner. And I knew that if I was in a classroom of 200 students, and I had visited some of these lecture halls at UCLA, there's no way I would have actually participated actively in my class. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, where I had to come to terms with that of, it's not just about, the degree or the name of the school that I was thinking of, but it's also, do I know myself well enough to realize that I'm not going to necessarily take advantage of everything that I'm hoping for if I am one of 15,000 students versus one of 500 in an incoming class. And that's, I think, where my counselors were really good about teasing out, well, what are some of these things that you really want to get out of your college experience? Having had that ability to travel, even if it was just one state over, I remember saying, like, I want to travel. I want to see parts of the country and the world that I haven't. I was involved in 2 sports in high school. So I wanted to be able to get involved in the life of a college. And I think that's where the residential experience that my counselors knew about from small liberal arts colleges really started to sound more and more appealing as I started meeting with the representatives. And to be honest, I think this is where I was a little, maybe didn't ask as many questions, but again, it was a pleasant surprise where I recognized I was a first-gen Latina woman at the time that I was applying to colleges back in 2002. Many of the campuses I was looking at were not very diverse. And I think I shared this, that when I first got to Bowdoin, I knew exactly who the other Hispanic students were. I knew who was exactly from California. It was easy enough to count. That has changed dramatically, but I think I also realized that my high school experience, yes, many of my closest friends were also Latinx. I also had many friends who were Korean because of where I grew up in LA. And I think more than anything, having my closest friends not be Latino and definitely not Guatemalan, that made me perhaps a little bit more comfortable with this idea of being at an institution and having a friend group who did not look like me. And I recognize that I think helped me get comfortable with the idea, but I also really encourage students every day in and out, even if they attend high schools where the majority of the students might be Hispanic or African American, or a combination of the two, the workforce that they're entering is not going to look like that, especially if they're really ambitious and are looking to go on into the business field or be an educator or whatever you name it. It's not as homogenous as some of the communities we've grown up. And I knew that if I really wanted to be successful and ambitious, it meant having to really push myself into some more areas of what could be discomfort. But I also really recognized that in my friend group and some of the activities that I joined while I was at Bowdoin, people became my friends, not because of the way we looked, but because there were values and shared ideas and the things that we really cared about. There were certainly the students who were in my very closest group, and I would go and sometimes vent with if I was really missing like LA street tacos, or missing something that really reminded me either of the city or really being able to speak Spanish, and having that just be the natural language. But some of my closest friends were actually white. And that was something that really at first was disconcerting, but then I was actually really okay with it, because I realized that that was one of the reasons why I had chosen to go to a school that was really different than I had grown up. Because many of the friendships I had in high school just naturally evolved because we were with each other since we were little kids. And once I actually had the choice to form friendships based on beliefs and values, it really went beyond kind of how we had grown up and who we were, and more about the things we cared about. So yeah, so sorry. I think I went on a tangent there.
Yeah. And I wonder, when you first got to Bowdoin, what did you look for supports? I mean, you just mentioned that you were able to find friends who weren't necessarily Latinas, but what were your expectations when you got there? What kind of supports were available? I know that things have changed tremendously, but how did you sort of navigate those first couple of weeks of college when you're kind of plunked down in the middle of Maine, so far from home, away from family? I mean, surely you must have been at some point homesick. How did you overcome that?
Yeah, so I mean, I will be honest, when I flew from California to Maine for my arrival day and orientation, I cried the entire flight. I cried myself to sleep. There was this moment, I was flying from LAX to Philly, and having to say goodbye to my mom and my grandmother and my sisters, and I had a few friends who came to the airport as well. It was gut-wrenching. There was this moment of like, holy crap, what did I do? Like, I am actually getting on this plane. And I cried. And I tell students that because it was by far, again, the right decision and the best decision, but there will be moments of tears and of doubt. And even when I arrived on campus, because it was before the age of social media, I realized I actually don't know anyone here. Like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Like, I was tired from my journey. People were so excited, and there was this huge welcome group, and it was overwhelming. And I'm like going along with the motions, but it was like, oh, I don't know where to start with some of these folks. And once we went off on orientation and started doing the activities that were part of the few days of our trips, that's where I think I started to realize, okay, like, let me just go with the flow and not overthink these things so much. What I wish I would have done, and I always tell students this, I didn't ask for help as much in my first few weeks on campus. And I think part of that comes from, one, not being fully aware of all of the resources that were there. And I think this is where colleges, and Bowdoin in particular, have gotten much better about trying to connect students to whether it's things like the Multicultural Center or the deans or academic support centers much earlier, and to normalize this idea of asking for help, or that these centers are there because they're there to serve you. Like, that wasn't necessarily what was part of my language or how to navigate. So I went through the normal orientation. We had our floor group. We had upperclassmen who came to give advice. And I listened, I think, intently. And then there were the moments of, I got this. I got into college. I was a really good student in high school. I can figure this out. And academically, it really took until the first paper in my econ class that I had taken for the first time. And I was like, what? I've never seen this grade on a paper before. And I will admit, I still didn't really figure out like, oh, I should probably go talk to my professor. At that point, it was, what else do I have to do? Like what extra notes do I need to take? And I was still trying to figure it out on my own. I think on the social side, there are two things that I did that I think really helped me. One was because Bowdoin was so different than my high school, or very much where I had grown up, everything was so new. And I was like, ooh, this sounds cool. And I think I kept an open mind. And that's one of those things where even now when I talk to students, they will be like, I've never experienced this. And I'm like, that doesn't make it bad. Like, give it a try before making a judgment on whether it's something that's for you or not. And I think because so much was new and just novel, I was like, oh, sure, why not? I'm going to go ahead and try out or go to this rugby practice. I have no idea what rugby is, but the girls seemed really cool. And because I had been an athlete, I'm like, I think I want to be part of a team still. And I think joining the rugby team within the first few weeks of being on campus was, I think, one of those things that allowed me to really have a routine in my schedule where I was going to class, and then after class and the work that I had to do, I had practice every day. It had me doing something so that I wasn't necessarily sitting in my room and feeling lonely or feeling like I was missing out on something at home. So I think being busy was helpful. But what I quickly realized too is, and I see this now as well, the rugby team in particular is this group that pulls women, and really even on the men's side, from all sorts of different backgrounds. It's a huge team. So the likelihood that there would, and there certainly were, other students of color, other people who had not played rugby before, we were all there to learn, but also a group that was really, once we got into it, on the field, we're certainly competitive, but I think there's this unique culture in rugby of really being there for your teammates. And part of it is it's a really physical sport. So you have to also be ready to protect your teammate and make sure that they're not getting hurt. And I think that really extended outside of the classroom, and not even the classroom, but really in our day-to-day lives. And the other group that, again, I'm fortunate for was my residential floor. There were three bedrooms or three apartments that were women, and then the floor below us were men, and we were part of this proctor group. I did not have the best experience with my first year roommate. We coexisted, but I think this idealized thing of my roommate becoming my best friend did not occur. However, one of the suites that was right across from me, those really became my people that, besides my rugby team, the other group of girls that I would hang out with and go out with, and some of their friends and connections then also became my kind of circle of friends. So I think there were these moments where I don't want to sound Pollyanna, but there were parts that could have been really hard, especially not getting along with my roommate and realizing we were just never going to be best friends. That could have been demoralizing. However, rather than seeing it as that, I was like, okay, well, this isn't what I was hoping for. How can I find what I was looking for? And I think having somewhat of an optimistic mindset was helpful, rather than dwelling in what wasn't working and being right. And I will admit, I cried. I would call home and I was like, I'm missing this. And I do remember the first time I saw snow. It was actually an exciting experience, but I also did not leave my dorm room until the middle of the day. I'm like, I looked out the window and I was like, oh, hell no. Like, that looks like a lot of snow. I don't think I'm ready. And I had an 8:30 morning class. I'm like, I'm not going out there. And it wasn't, I had to leave my room to finally go to lunch. And once I actually left, it was this moment of, oh, it's actually not that cold. And realizing that when it's actually snowing, it's not that cold. It's afterwards where these things come. So I think some of it had to just be the learning by experience. But even again, the first snowfall was gorgeous. Do I still think it's gorgeous by February? Not so much, but I think it's become now just part of life that I can, again, still see the positives. They're the things that I complain about, but I don't let those kind of overtake the general experience. And that would be, I think, my other big piece of advice for students is college is not going to be perfect. Whether you're staying closer to home, you're going to a fabulous institution like Bowdoin, no place is perfect. There are going to be really tough moments, and some of them will really test you. But it doesn't mean that life is terrible, and that there might be some silver linings that you can still find for yourself that get you through a really tough moment, or give you some better, different perspective as well.
So what did you do about vacations? Because I assume that you were not able to go to California for Thanksgiving and, for the shorter vacations.
Not so. So I think this was the other thing where I had prioritized, and I think to some degree, I realized that going home for the Thanksgiving break was going to really be important. So there was a really short break. I won't lie. The October break, which our students are actually starting tomorrow, it's a 4 or 5 day long weekend. I did not go back to California for that. However, I did go with one of my friends to New York. And that was one of those things where I'm like, I had never been to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really exciting. And again, it was wonderful that I had a friend who invited me back to her home. And there were actually 3 of us who ended up going with her and staying with that family. But for Thanksgiving, I realized I do actually want to go home. I'm not ready. Like, it had been about 2.5 months at that point. And with my campus job earnings, I had been saving for that. And I had early on realized, okay, when I leave in August, the first realistic time that I can go home is going to be Thanksgiving. So I made that my goal. And I did go home for Thanksgiving. And throughout my 4 years at Bowdoin, I went home for 3 Thanksgivings, all of my winter breaks, which at Bowdoin end up being about 5 weeks long. So mid-December to about the end of January. I went home for 2 spring breaks.
Wow.
And each of my summers. So I also tell students, if you plan, yes, cost can be hard. I never ended up having to take out loans for my travel. It was from my work earnings and saving for that, that I made it a priority. And I think the other thing too that I look back on is when I would go home for some of these breaks, even winter break, which was a longer one, I ended up spending a lot of time at home with my family. I would see some of my friends from high school, and that certainly got to be a little bit less and less as we also diverged and became different people. But it made my time back at home with family, I think, more meaningful, because I was there to see them. I was helping my grandmother out more, trying to reconnect with my sisters, and make up for some of that lost time. So it felt like it was really a worthwhile time back home.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Thanksgiving I did not go home for. I went down to Boston with one of the girls who lived on my floor my first year. So it was my second Thanksgiving that I didn't go home for. And I was actually kind of excited by that at that point too, because I was like, I was thinking of studying abroad. So I think there was a little bit more of being okay with distance by that point. And then the 2 spring breaks I did not go home for, I was actually doing some cool things with the college. So my first year, I actually traveled to Guatemala, which is where I was born, to do a community service trip. And it had been probably about 10 years since I had been back in Guatemala. So while I wasn't at home with my mom, I did end up spending some time with my aunt and cousins when I was in Guatemala. So I did get some family time, but I also got to travel in Guatemala in a way that I hadn't seen it before. So I think there was that piece of it being enticing. And then the second year, my sophomore year, I also didn't go home over spring break because I actually traveled with the rugby team to London. So I think there's this assumption that if you don't go home, you might be staying on campus. And that's very much the case for some students, but it may not be for that entire break. And I think, again, I made I think best choices for myself for those 2 spring breaks of traveling and trying to find a new activity. And that's why I didn't go home. It wasn't because it was a cost issue or trying to figure it out. It was because there was another opportunity in front of me that at that point seemed like the right choice to make. And the piece that I think I have to mention is I mentioned that college is not ever going to be perfect and easy. The end of my so in my sophomore year, right when I was getting all of my applications ready for my study abroad program, I actually found out that my mom had cancer. And once we learned more, we found out that it was actually stage 4 and was very likely terminal. So, that's where I had a lot of decisions to make. The very first one, which was the easiest one to make, was that I was no longer going to study abroad. The distance between LA and Maine was great. I had been planning to go to Italy, and that was actually one of the easiest choices of I'm not doing the study abroad program. I remember my mom being devastated because I had been talking about it. And I was like, Italy will be there. Like, I need to be able to get back home if I needed to. I think the second whammy that hit that same year was in the spring of my sophomore year. We then also found out that my grandmother also had cancer, and she was much older. So the ability to do intervention and to really have surgery was not going to be much of a outcome there. So I ended up staying on campus my junior year. There was this moment of talking to my deans of, do I take a leave of absence, a personal leave to be at home? And I don't know if I would do things differently now. At that time, I remember the plan was, well, if I stay on this track, will my mom be able to see me graduate? And that was one of the main priorities. But the other piece was also realizing that, and this is where I would sometimes counsel students differently, maybe, is in my mind, you go to college in 4 years. Like, you are on this track, that this is the motion. Anything less than that ends up maybe not being successful, or you've had to delay something for a personal reason, or maybe it's an academic one. So I wonder if I would have made a different choice, now, if my full self now was in my 18-year-old body or 19-year-old body. But I don't know. I did get home again. I think that's where in my junior and senior year, I went home for Thanksgiving. I went home for winter breaks, for spring breaks. It became far more of a priority to make sure I was having that meaningful time. And it certainly wasn't easy. I think there are the moments where I think back, how selfish was I of, going through these amazing experiences at college when my older sister and my younger sister were at home, seeing the ramifications of cancer and what it was doing to my mom. I think there were the moments where when I would come back, I was like, okay, I'm here now. Like, I'll do all of the medical things and trying to take my part as a member of the family. And I think those are really still really hard things for students. And again, I don't know if I made the right choice, but I had to move forward with the choice that I made. And my mom so my grandmother passed away in my junior year, and being closer to home, obviously I didn't go abroad that spring. I made it back, and the college helped me make my trip back. I arrived at the hospital maybe a day or two before my grandmother passed away. It was hard. I don't think I really got that same closure that I needed, but I made it back to her bedside before she passed. And then with my mother, she passed away the winter break of my senior year. So I was home over that December break. We had her services in January, and then I came back to school. And it was one of those things of like I won't say that my final semester was, very different, but it was like, there were the moments where I would operate, I think, just like any other student on our campus. And then I also had this new challenge on my horizon that I didn't really think I had a home to go back to. I wasn't very close to my stepfather. And in some ways, I know how this is going to sound. It was a little liberating of like, okay, like I can again now make a choice rather than my only choice being going back home. And I think that's different for some students. I had friends from California who went back, and that was wonderful. And they're living amazing lives in Los Angeles. But I think the trajectory of my personal experiences, I remember crying when I told my sister I found a job in Boston. And now she has visited Boston several times. Like, she loves Maine now. And I've gotten to bring my younger sister and my nieces out east as well. But I say all of that because they weren't easy choices by any means. And I don't know if I make the right ones and if I would make them again. But you have to forge forward. And at the end of the day, the education I had was transformative. The connections and the networks that I've been exposed to have allowed me to really dream bigger. And never did I think I'd be a senior vice president and a dean of an office and have this opportunity. I just got back from traveling internationally. I'll be traveling again for the college in 2 weeks. Those weren't experiences I thought I was going to have. And part of it is I just went with the flow, making decisions that felt right in the moment, and certainly having conversations with not only family, but also advisors who could also give an unbiased opinion, and one that was not so rooted in, the moment, but being able to have a point of view that was a little bit more removed.
So what did you major in?
I majored in art history and minored in government and legal studies.
Oh, okay.
So along the way, I did also take psychology courses. I took some chemistry and I mentioned econ in my first year. So I got to sample quite a bit. And I think part of my sampling was trying to decide. I knew about, med school and law school and business school. Those were the things that were defined as being successful when I was in high school. So I took econ because I was like, well, I kind of need to take econ if I want to think about business school. I took chemistry and bio and realized, yeah, medical school is not going to be in my future. And that's perfectly okay. Like, labs were fun, but it wasn't something that came instinctually, nor did it bring me joy. And there was this moment in an art history class. It may have been the professor, I won't lie, she was fantastic. But part of it, I think, was this, it goes back to this idea of like dreaming and traveling and where in the world am I going to go, and seeing images of the pyramids in Egypt and art from Italy and all of these different artifacts that I was learning about. That became, I think, so fascinating to me. Like, what are the stories of these cultures? And then I started realizing that it could also blend into interests that I had in government and just society and social issues. So I think I did come into Bowdoin being like, I don't know what I'm going to major in. There's these career paths that I'm going to attempt, and then realizing, oh, those were just because I had heard of them. But now that I'm taking classes in areas my high school didn't offer, these are actually the things I'm most interested in. And I did have some really cool internships at museums. So I did explore, definitely with art history, is this going to take me down the museum curating path, research? Is it more about conservation? Government was also just the place where the conversations were fascinating, especially when we were talking about things like Black rights, now even more so, just police brutality and whatnot. And then I ended up in education, which fascinates me because when I think back to some of the things I was doing outside of the classroom, I mentioned that first trip to Guatemala with our McKean Center. It was actually working at a school founded by a Bowdoin alumna near the city dump in Guatemala. And I think that was one of these first moments of realizing if my mom hadn't immigrated, what would my life have been like? And seeing that she immigrated for better education for me and my sister. And there was an interest in what does that actually mean? How is education more of a social mobility tool? What can you do with it? And then I was working at some high schools in the area through Bowdoin that I think I just serendipitously fell into education. And now it's one of the things that I have made my career, obviously. But I think that's my other thing about liberal arts colleges and for students is you can have a plan and it's okay if you deviate from that. And you're never, I wouldn't close off that there's only one career that can be successful. Because one of the things I'm most fortunate about, if I lean over, you'll see some photos on my wall. Even though I didn't study abroad, I have now traveled to 52 different countries.
Wow.
And a big part of that is because of education and the work that I have now that's enabled me to do that. And that's a whole different form of success and personal fulfillment that I have.
That's an amazing story. I'm so glad we were able to capture that. Thank you so much. Leona, were there any other questions?
Yeah, but they don't need to be recorded.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'll stop the recording and then you can ask them.